The sound was wrong. Corwin knew the sounds of winter the way a man who has survived 12 of them alone knows anything. By repetition, by pattern, by the specific accumulated literacy of a body that has learned to read its environment because misreading it means dying. But if the man found the better wife than the land, then wasn't his son, he would now find out what he had once. Dawn was the unseen world of what he had once done, in an unclean mind of cursing oil and growth, a final flesh of charm. Winter had a vocabulary wind through bare branches, ice settling on the river at night, the deep structural groans of water accepting its solid state, snow compacting under boot, the particular silence that follows a storm when the world has been rearranged and is holding still to assess the damage. This sound was not in the vocabulary, a crack, sharp, percussive, followed by a secondary sound, not a crack, but a collapse, the specific acoustic signature of a surface giving way beneath weight, ice breaking. Not the gradual, seasonal breaking of spring thaw, but the sudden, catastrophic failure of a frozen surface that had been asked to support something it couldn't. Then a sound that Edric would hear in his sleep for months afterward. A voice, short, cut off, swallowed by water and cold and the immediate total physics of a body entering a river through a hole in the ice. He was 200 yards upstream, pulling a fish trap from a hole he'd cut that morning. He dropped the trap. He ran. The river was called the Ashburn. It ran east-west through the border country, dividing human farmland from the forested hills where the Orc clans made their settlements. In summer, it was fordable in a dozen places, shallow, clear, cold enough to numb your feet and fast enough to remind you that water was not a surface but a force. In winter, it froze and the freezing was uneven, thick at the banks where the current was slow, thin at the center where the flow ran deep and fast and never fully surrendered to the cold. The hole was at the center. Of course it was. The thin ice, the deep current, the worst possible location for a person to break through. Edric could see the edges of the break. A ragged oval, 3 feet across, the ice around it already reforming in the sub-zero air. The water dark and churning where the body had gone under. He could see a hand. Green. The hand was green. Not the pale, bloodless green of a person who has been underwater too long. The natural pigmented green of orc skin, darker at the knuckles, lighter at the palm. An orc hand reaching through the surface of the ice hole, fingers spread, gripping the edge of the break with a strength that was already failing. Edric didn't think. Thinking required time, and time was a currency that hypothermia spent faster than any mind could earn. He dropped to his belly. Weight distribution, the ice was thin, standing would break more, and crawled to the edge of the hole. He grabbed the wrist. The skin was cold, not human cold. Deeper, more alarming. The specific temperature of a body whose thermal baseline ran higher than human, and was therefore losing heat at a rate that human physiology could not match. Orc body temperature was 5 degrees above human normal. Hypothermia in orcs was not a gradual decline, but a cliff. The body maintained its elevated temperature until it couldn't, and then it dropped, fast and far, and without the incremental stages that gave human hypothermia victims time to be found and treated. This orc was past the cliff. The skin under Edric's hand was not cold. It was approaching the temperature of the water around it, which meant the body behind the hand was minutes from a shutdown that would not be reversed. He pulled. The ice cracked under his weight. He redistributed, knees wider, belly flatter, the maximum surface area he could achieve without releasing the wrist. He pulled again. The body came up, heavy, waterlogged, the dead weight of a person whose muscles had stopped cooperating with their nervous system. She came out of the water in sections, arm, shoulder, head, dark hair, plastered to a face that was gray-green rather than the olive green it should have been. The pigment retreating as the blood retreated, the body redirecting every resource to the core and abandoning the extremities to the cold. Torso, hips, legs. She came out like something the river was reluctant to release, the water clinging to her clothes and her skin, and the leather armor she was wearing, scout armor, light, designed for movement rather than protection. She was not breathing. Edric dragged her away from the hole. 10 feet, 15, onto ice that was thick enough to hold both of them. He turned her on her side. Water ran from her mouth, river water cold, carrying the mineral taste of the Ashburn's winter flow. He pressed on her back. More water. He pressed again. She coughed. The cough was weak, wet. The involuntary reflex of lungs that had been invited to resume operations and were not enthusiastic about the invitation. But she coughed, which meant she was breathing, which meant she was alive, which meant the next problem was not resuscitation, but warmth. And warmth was 400 yards away in a cabin with a fireplace. He carried her. She weighed more than a human woman of equivalent size would have. Orc bone density, orc muscle mass, the physical infrastructure of a species that was built heavier and harder than human. His back screamed at him, his knees filed formal complaints. He carried her anyway across the ice, up the bank, through the snow, across the yard, through the door. The cabin was one room, stone fireplace, single bed, a table, 2 chairs that existed because the furniture maker had sold them in pairs, and Edric had not had the social confidence to request only one. The fire was low, banked coals, the residual heat of a morning fire that had been left to sustain itself while its owner went fishing. Edric built it up, fast. The coals caught the kindling, and the kindling caught the split oak, and within minutes the fire was producing the aggressive, immediate heat that the situation demanded. The orc girl was on the floor beside the hearth. Her clothes were soaked. The leather armor, the linen shirt beneath it, the hide trousers, the boots. Everything was saturated with river water that was, even now, continuing to draw heat from her body through the specific, merciless physics of evaporative cooling. He needed to remove the wet clothes. He needed to not think about the fact that he was removing the clothes of an unconscious orc woman he had never met, in a cabin with no witnesses, in a border region where the relationship between humans and orcs was measured in fence lines and funeral counts. He removed them efficiently, mechanically, with the specific, clinical detachment of a man performing a medical procedure rather than a personal act. The armor came off first, buckles and straps orc made, the hardware heavier than human equivalents. Then the shirt, then the boots, which required pulling because the leather had contracted in the cold. He wrapped her in every dry fabric the cabin contained. The bed blanket, his spare shirt, the sheepskin he used as a door draft. He positioned her beside the fire, close enough for the heat to reach her, far enough to prevent burns on skin that couldn't feel them. He sat beside her. He waited. The hours passed with the specific, grinding slowness of time experienced by a person who cannot influence an outcome and cannot stop monitoring it. He watched her breathing, the shallow, irregular rhythm of lungs that were working but not committed. He watched her skin, the gray-green gradually warming, the pigment returning in patches as the blood crept back to the surface. He fed the fire. He boiled water and pressed a warm cloth against her throat, her wrists, the pulse points where heat could be delivered to the blood directly. At hour 3, her skin color stabilized. The gray-green was replaced by a pale olive. Not healthy, not normal, but alive, living color. The color of a body that had decided, after sustained deliberation, to continue operating. At hour 4, he noticed the mark. Her left arm, from shoulder to wrist, had changed. The skin that should have been olive green was white, not pale. White. The pigment had been destroyed by the cold, the cellular damage of sustained hypothermia killing the color-producing cells and leaving behind a bleached, permanent absence, a stripe of white running the length of her arm, stark against the green visible from across the room. A frostbite scar. In orc physiology, permanent. The skin would heal, the muscle would recover, the nerves would return, but the color would not. The arm would be white for the rest of her life, a visible, indelible record of the night. She went into the river and the cold took something from her that could not be returned. At hour 6, she opened her eyes, amber, deep, resinous, the color of old-growth sap caught in a shaft of firelight. The eyes opened and found the ceiling, unfamiliar timber, unfamiliar arrangement, and the body attached to them went rigid with the instantaneous total system alert of a person waking in an unknown location. Her hand moved, the right hand reaching for the left hip, Where Edric noted, a knife sheath was attached to the belt she was no longer wearing. The hand found nothing. The knife was on the table, placed there by Edric during the undressing. Visible, but out of reach. "You're safe," Edric said. The amber eyes found him. The assessment was rapid, comprehensive. Military, the evaluation of a trained scout processing a new variable. Male, human. Sitting on the floor, unarmed, 3 feet away. The cabin was warm. The fire was high. She was wrapped in blankets that were not hers. "Where am I?" Her common was fluent, accented, the guttural undertones of Orcish phonology shaping the consonants, the product of a bilingual education that prioritized function over elegance. "My farm, by the Ashburn, you went through the ice. I pulled you out. How long? 6 hours. You almost didn't make it." She looked at the fire. She looked at the blankets. She looked at the table where her clothes were draped, drying, steaming slightly in the heat, the leather armor dark with residual moisture. She looked at the knife on the table. Then she looked at her left arm. The white mark was fully visible now, a continuous stripe from the point of her shoulder to the inside of her wrist, crossing the bicep, the elbow, the forearm. White against green. The contrast was severe, unmistakable, a permanent alteration that no amount of healing would reverse. The reaction was not what Edric expected. He expected pain, or distress, or the specific grief of a person discovering permanent damage. What he saw was worse. Terror. Kaelra, because her name was Kaelra, as he would learn in the next 30 seconds, looked at the white mark on her arm, and her face drained of the color that had just returned to it. The amber eyes went wide, the jaw clamped. The body that had been gradually relaxing into the warmth of the cabin retensed, every muscle engaging simultaneously, the fight-or-flight response firing in a body that was too weak to fight and too damaged to fly. "No," she said. The word was small, compressed, pushed through a throat that was constricting. "No, no, no. What's wrong? The mark. You pulled me out. Yes. You saved me. Yes. You were drowning. You shouldn't have done that." Edric looked at the orc woman wrapped in his blankets, on the floor of his cabin, 6 hours past the point of death, telling him that the act of saving her life was a mistake. "You would have died," he said. "Dying would have been simpler." She looked at the white mark. She pressed her green hand against the white skin, the contrast of the two colors, the living and the damaged, side by side on the same arm. "This mark, do you know what it means? Frostbite scar. To humans, to orcs, this mark says, 'Someone saved me.' Every orc who sees this will know. The white says I was dead, and someone pulled me back. And the person who pulled me back..." She stopped. The sentence had reached a place she didn't want to go. Her amber eyes found Edric's face. "What?" Edric said. "You own a debt. It's called Threv Cal in our language, the weight of a returned life. I cannot leave you until the debt is paid." "What does that mean?" "It means I stay, here, with you, until I save your life, until the debt is balanced. If I leave before then, my clan strips my name. My family forgets me. I become no one." The fire crackled. The wind pressed against the cabin walls. The wet clothes steamed on the table. 2 people, 1 human, 1 orc, sat on the floor of a one-room cabin at the edge of a frozen river, processing the discovery that a simple act of rescue had activated a system neither of them had chosen and that only one of them had known about. "I was just trying to keep you alive," Edric said. "I know," Kaelra said. "That's what makes it worse." He pulled her from the ice. She opened her eyes and saw the white mark on her arm. "You shouldn't have done that," she said, not because she wanted to die, because she knew what living cost. Threv Cal, the weight of a returned life. She can't leave until she saves his. He just wanted to keep her alive. She told him that was the problem. Subscribe to Human and Orc Girl History to learn what the mark really means. Drop your city in the comments. Edric offered the bed. Kaelra refused. Not politely, not with the diplomatic softening that humans applied to refusals. A flat structural no that closed the topic the way a door closes a room. "I don't sleep in your house. That's not how Threfcal works. The debtor stays close but separate. I protect you. I don't live with you. She built her sleeping space in the barn's upper loft, a platform of hay bales, a horse blanket, the sheepskin Edric offered, and she accepted after a negotiation that lasted 4 exchanges and produced a compromise neither of them was happy with. The compromise was, she would take the sheepskin, but she would not acknowledge the taking as a kindness, because acknowledging kindness from her creditor complicated the debt's architecture in ways that Edric did not understand, and Kaelra did not explain. The first 3 days were a study in parallel silence. Edric worked his farm, he fed the cattle, he repaired the fence section that the snow had buckled. He split firewood, a task that winter demanded daily, and that his back protested equally daily. He performed these tasks in the specific practiced rhythm of a man who had been doing them alone for 4 years, and whose body had adapted to the solitude the way a tree adapts to prevailing wind, leaning into it, shaped by it, functional within it. Kaelra watched. She sat on the barn's upper rail, wrapped in the sheepskin she was not acknowledging as a kindness, and she watched Edric work with the comprehensive evaluative attention of a trained scout, assessing an environment. She was cataloging distances, sight lines, entry points, the specific defensive geography of a farm that was not a military installation but that her training insisted on analyzing as one. They spoke fewer than 10 words the first day, fewer than 15 the second. On the 3rd day, Kaelra descended from the loft at dawn, walked to the woodpile, picked up the axe, and split the entire cord that Edric had been planning to work through over the course of the week. She did it in 40 minutes. The axe was designed for human hands, too short in the handle, too light in the head for orc physiology. She adapted. Each swing was adjusted for the tool's limitations, the blade finding the grain with a precision that suggested either extensive experience with wood or the specific transferable accuracy of a person whose training had taught her to use any tool effectively, regardless of its origin. Edric watched from the doorway. The firewood was done. His morning's work completed before the morning had properly started by a person who had not been asked to help and who was not, by the terms of the arrangement she had described, obligated to help. Threvcall required her to stay. It did not require her to split wood. The splitting was something else. A statement, a contribution, a declaration that she was not a guest and not a prisoner, but a participant, and that participation required work. You didn't have to do that, Edric said. The debt says I stay. It doesn't say I sit. Thank you. Don't thank me. Thanking complicates the ledger. What ledger? The one between us. Every kindness adds weight to one side. The sides need to stay balanced until the debt resolves. If you thank me, you add weight to my side. If I accept the thanks, I acknowledge the weight. The debt becomes heavier. Edric looked at the orc woman standing in his yard, holding his axe, having just completed his work, explaining to him that gratitude was a form of accounting that had structural implications for an obligation he had not agreed to incur. This is very complicated, he said. This is very arc, she said. Your system would be, she helped, say thanks, move on. Our system has more steps. How many more? You don't want to know. The town found out on the 5th day. Edric rode to the general store for lamp oil and salt. The store owner, a man named Garrett, whose primary talent was the simultaneous operation of a retail business and an intelligence network, looked at Edric with the particular expression of a person who has received information and is deciding whether to deploy it as conversation or ammunition. Here you've got company, Garrett said. News travels. In this town, news doesn't travel. It sprints. The Marsh boys saw smoke from your barn chimney at a time when your barn doesn't usually have smoke. They mentioned it to their father. Their father mentioned it to me. I mentioned it to nobody, which is why everyone knows. It's temporary. The orc woman living in your barn is temporary. She's not living in my barn. She's... Edric stopped. The accurate description of the situation, she was drowning. I pulled her out, and now she can't leave because of an ancient orc honor code that I didn't know existed and don't fully understand. Was not a sentence that would improve his position in Garrett's ledger. She's recovering from an injury, Edric said. She'll move on. Recovering in your barn. Where would you suggest? The inn? Millie doesn't serve orcs. Millie doesn't serve orcs because orcs don't come to Millie's. There's a reason for that. The reason is that we've spent 10 years building a border that keeps people apart, and now we're surprised that they're apart. Garrett processed this with the squinting, recalculating expression that he applied to all information that challenged his existing inventory of beliefs. People are talking, Edric. People always talk. That's not my problem to manage. It becomes your problem when they stop talking and start acting. Edric bought his salt and lamp oil and rode home. The bone-deep certainty that the conversation would be the first of many sat in his chest like a stone, present, heavy, not going anywhere. Kaelra was in the yard when he returned. She was repairing the cattle fence, not with Edric's tools, which were laid out beside the fence in the order he had left them, but with her hands, orc hands. She was bending the iron wire by grip, twisting the connections tight with fingers that treated metal the way human fingers treated thread, as a material that required technique, but not tools. "You fixed the fence," Edric said. "Your wire was loose. 3 sections. The cattle would have been through by morning." "How did you know which sections?" "I walked the line. The snow shows where the weight pushes. The posts lean before they break. Your south section has 2 weeks. The east has less. You walked my entire fence line. I'm a scout. Walking perimeters is what I do when I'm not doing anything else." Edric dismounted. He stood in the yard, his farm, his fences, and looked at the orc woman who had walked his perimeter, identified the structural weaknesses, and repaired them before he asked, before he noticed, before the cattle noticed. She had done this not because the debt required it, but because she was a scout, and scouts assessed terrain, and terrain included fence lines, and fence lines included the specific, invisible vulnerabilities that a trained eye could detect and an untrained eye would miss until the cattle were in the neighbor's field. "The town is talking," Edric said. "Of course they are. It doesn't bother you? I'm an orc woman living in a human man's barn in a border town. If they weren't talking, I'd be worried. Worried about what? About what they were doing instead of talking. Talking is the safe version. When humans stop talking about orcs, they start doing things to orcs. The talking is the warning. The silence is the threat." The sentence was delivered with the flat, experiential authority of a person who had lived on the other side of a border long enough to learn its behavioral patterns. Kaelra was not guessing. She was reporting. The evenings were the hardest. Edric ate in the cabin. Kaelra ate in the barn. The separation was her choice, maintained with the rigid discipline of a person following a protocol that had been internalized so deeply it functioned as physiology rather than decision. Debtor and creditor. Separate fires, separate tables, separate silences. But the silences were different from Edric's pre-Kaelra silences. Before, the quiet of the cabin had been the quiet of one person, complete, self-contained, needing nothing because nothing was expected. Now, the quiet had a second frequency in it. The awareness that 30 feet away in the barn, another person was eating, breathing, existing in a parallel silence that was shaped by the same evening, and the same cold, and the same darkness. But that was experienced alone, because the rules of an obligation neither of them had wanted required the aloneness. On the 8th night, Edric carried a bowl of stew to the barn. He set it on the hay bale beside Kaelra's sleeping platform. He didn't say anything. He walked back to the cabin. The next morning, the bowl was empty. Cleaned, placed on the hay bale in the exact position where he had set it. On the 9th night, he brought stew again. Same hay bale, same silence, same departure. On the 10th night, Kaelra was standing at the barn door when he arrived. She took the bowl from his hands. Their fingers overlapped on the transfer. His cold, hers warm, the elevated orc body temperature radiating through the ceramic. "This is adding weight to the ledger," she said. "Stew weighs less than firewood. That's not how the ledger works. Then the ledger can adjust." The corner of her mouth moved. Not a smile, the pre-seismic activity that preceded a smile in a face that had been trained to suppress them. The movement was small, controlled, intercepted before completion. But Edric saw it because Edric noticed things. And the thing he noticed was that the orc woman who had been living in his barn for 10 days had almost smiled. and the almost was a door that had opened 1 inch. The white mark on Kaelra's arm grew more visible every day. As her health returned, the color deepening, the strength rebuilding, the body resuming its normal operations after the near shutdown of hypothermia, the contrast between the healthy green skin and the damaged white stripe became more severe. The green got greener. The white stayed white. The arm looked like 2 different limbs joined at the shoulder, one belonging to the person Kaelra was, and one belonging to the person the river had tried to make her. She covered it when she could. Long sleeves, the sheepskin wrapped around her shoulders. But work required movement, and movement required range, and range required the sleeves to be pushed back. And when the sleeves were pushed back, the mark was visible to anyone within 20 feet. One evening, by the barn fire, Edric saw her looking at it. She was pressing her green hand against the white skin, the way you press your hand against a wound to check if it still hurts. The gesture was private, unguarded, performed with the assumption that she was unobserved. "Does it hurt?" Edric asked. She startled the scout, who heard everything, who tracked movement through sound, who could identify approaching footsteps from 100 yards. She had not heard him. The private moment had consumed her attention entirely. "No, it doesn't hurt." "Then why do you touch it?" Kaelra looked at the mark. The amber eyes held the specific, layered quality of a person looking at something that is part of them and separate from them simultaneously. Every orc who sees this will know what happened. They will know I was dead and someone brought me back. They will know the debt is open, unpaid. The white is. She searched for the word. Announcement. You can't hide it. You can't cover it. It tells every orc in every room you enter, this woman owes a life. And when the debt is paid, the mark changes. White becomes silver. Silver means the debt was honored. But until then, she pulled her sleeve down. Until then, it's a billboard that says I'm incomplete. You're not incomplete. By my people's measure, I am. I owe a life. My ledger is unbalanced. In orc culture, an unbalanced person is an unfinished person. And unfinished people don't have the right to. She stopped. The right to what? It doesn't matter. It matters to you. Many things matter to me. Not all of them are your concern. The sentence closed the topic. Edric accepted the closure. He had learned, in 10 days of parallel cohabitation, that Kaelra's boundaries were not walls but doors, closed by default, opened by choice, and never forced. Forcing produced reinforcement. Patience produced keys. He walked back to the cabin. The stew bowl was on the hay bale. Tomorrow night he would bring it again. The ledger could adjust. On the 14th night, Kaelra asked the question. They were in the yard. Edric repairing a harness. Kaelra sharpening tools on the whetstone. The stars were out. The cold was deep and still, and the kind of cold that makes sound travel farther than it should. "How do I pay the debt?" Kaelra asked. Edric looked up from the harness. "You told me. Save my life. Your life needs to be in danger. Real danger. Imminent death. And I have to be the one who prevents it. Those are the conditions. And if my life is never in danger, then the debt never closes. And you never leave. And I never leave." The statement sat between them, in the yard under the stars, between the harness and the whetstone. 2 people, bound by an obligation that required one of them to nearly die in order for the other one to be free. Is that? Edric stopped. The question he was forming was dangerous, and he knew it, and he formed it anyway. Is that a punishment for you? Kaelra's hand stopped on the whetstone. The blade she was sharpening, Edric's fence knife, the one with the nick in the edge, rested against the stone, motionless. "It was," she said. "The first week, it was. I wanted to leave. I wanted to go home. I wanted to walk north and cross the river and find my clan and be done with this debt and this farm and this human who pulled me out of water I didn't ask to be pulled from. And now I'm sharpening your fence knife and you're fixing a harness and neither of us is talking about leaving. Is that an answer? It's the closest I can give you." The stars observed. The cold persisted. The harness was repaired. The fence knife was sharp, and somewhere in the space between the question and the answer, a door that had been open 1 inch opened. 14 nights, Stew on a hay bale. A fence line walked before he asked, a white mark growing brighter on an arm she couldn't hide. "Is this a punishment?" he asked. "It was," she said, "the first week. And now I'm sharpening your fence knife, and neither of us is talking about leaving. If that inch means something to you, join the Human and Orc Girl History membership. Super thanks if the ledger already shifted in your chest. Drop your city. The weeks accumulated the way snow accumulates. Gradually, without announcement, each edition indistinguishable from the last until you look up and discover that the landscape has changed. They found a rhythm, not the rhythm of two people who had chosen to live together, but the specific, functional rhythm of two people whose circumstances required cooperation, and whose cooperation had evolved, without discussion, into something that resembled partnership. Kaelra hunted. She was an orc scout, and scouting included the procurement of food through methods that did not involve agriculture. She left before dawn, moved through the forest with a silence that her frame should not have permitted, and returned by midday with game, rabbits, sometimes a deer, once a wild turkey that she presented with the specific, understated pride of a person who considered the kill noteworthy, but was not going to say so. The meat supplemented Edric's root vegetables and stored grain, and the supplementation improved both their diets in ways that the stew, now shared at Edric's table rather than delivered to the barn, a transition that had occurred on the 20th night without negotiation or acknowledgement, made evident. Edric farmed. The winter farm was a maintenance operation, repairing tools, preparing seed, tending the cattle through the cold months when feed was rationed and the animals' patience was not. Kaelra helped with the physical work, the lifting, the hauling, the tasks that her orc strength converted from labor to routine. The fence line, which had been Edric's perpetual losing battle against weather and cattle and the general tendency of structures to deteriorate, was now maintained at a standard that his own efforts had never achieved. They talked. Not constantly. The orc preference for silence and the human preference for solitude combined to produce conversations that were efficient, rather than expansive. But the conversations, when they occurred, had begun to venture beyond the functional. "Why are you here?" Kaelra asked one evening. "This farm, this border, alone. My wife died. 4 years ago, the town we lived in felt wrong afterward. Too many rooms with her things in them. I moved out here because the silence was honest. Honest. In town, the silence is what people leave behind when they stop talking. Out here, the silence is what the world sounds like when nobody's pretending." Kaelra considered this. The consideration was visible, the slight tilt of her head, the narrowing of her amber eyes, the specific physical indicators of an orc mind processing a concept that was foreign to its cultural framework and finding, to its surprise, that the concept fit. "Orcs don't have a word for loneliness," she said. "We have a word for separation, being apart from your clan. But the orc word carries shame. You chose separation without shame. That's," she searched for the translation, "new to me. Is it bad? It's interesting," which in Orcish is what we say when something is too complicated to judge. The storm arrived on a Tuesday, not the ordinary storms that the border country produced in winter. The manageable, predictable weather events that dropped snow, lowered temperatures, and moved on within a day. This was a structural storm, the kind that the old farmers called a breaker because it broke things. Roofs, fences, supply lines, the accumulated confidence that human infrastructure was sufficient to withstand whatever the sky decided to deliver. The wind came first. It came from the north, a sustained 40-mile gale that hit the farm like a wall in motion, pressing against every surface, finding every gap, converting every loose object into a projectile. The barn doors rattled. The cabin shutters, which Edric had secured that morning, hammered against their latches. The cattle huddled in the lee of the barn wall, their backs to the wind, their breath visible in the horizontal air. Then the snow. Not falling, driving. Horizontal sheets of white that reduced visibility to 20 feet, then 10, then 5. The farm disappeared into the storm. The barn became a dark shape. The fence line vanished. The world contracted to the immediate radius of whatever surface you were standing on, and everything beyond that radius was noise and cold and the specific animal understanding that survival required shelter. and shelter required proximity. Edric and Kaelra were in the barn when the storm peaked. The cattle were fed. The horses were secure. The barn structure, old timber, heavy framing, built by a man who understood that the weight of a roof was a partnership between the wood and the weather, was holding. Then the groaning started. The roof, the weight of the accumulated snow, already a foot deep on the flat sections, drifting deeper in the leeward pockets, was exceeding the structural capacity of the northern beams. The wood was talking. Not the settling sounds of a building adjusting to normal loads, but the specific, urgent sounds of materials approaching their failure point. Creaking, popping, the high-pitched protest of fibers being pushed past their design tolerance. The roof, Edric said. I hear it. The snow needs clearing. If the north section collapses, the cattle are underneath. In this. Edric moved toward the ladder that accessed the roof hatch. Kaelra stepped into his path. No. Kaelra, the roof is 30 feet up. The wind is strong enough to take a man off his feet. The snow is blinding. You go up there. You come down. Fast and permanent. My barn, my cattle, my problem, my debit. Your life is my responsibility until I clear the ledger. If you die on that roof, I fail the Threfkow. You don't get to choose my failure for me. The sentence was delivered with the specific, compressed intensity of a person who was not making a request, but drawing a line. Kaelra's amber eyes held Edric's face with the full spectrum focus that he had learned to associate with moments when the Orc Scout was operating in operational mode, the mode where decisions were not discussed, but executed. I'll clear the roof, she said. I'm heavier. My center of gravity is lower. Orc feet grip better than human feet. And if I fall, she paused. If I fall, the debt dies with me, and you're free. I don't want to be free at that cost. Then trust me not to fall. She climbed. The ladder shook in the wind. The roof hatch opened onto a surface that was white and moving and hostile. The snow driving across the cedar bark in sheets, the wind grabbing at everything that extended above the roofline. Kaelra pushed through the hatch, braced herself against the chimney stack, and began shoveling snow with her hands. Orc hands. Broader than human. Stronger, more resistant to cold. Not immune. The hypothermia in the river had proved that orc cold tolerance had limits. But in a sustained effort scenario, clearing snow from a roof in a gale, orc physiology was built for exactly this kind of work. The hands that had split Edric's firewood in 40 minutes now cleared 100-pound loads of snow from the barn roof with a methodical, relentless efficiency that the storm's fury could not match. Edric watched from below. He stood in the barn with his neck craned upward, listening to the sounds above. The scraping of snow, the creak of the beams relaxing as the weight was reduced, the muffled sounds of Kaelra's boots on the cedar bark. Then a different sound. A crack. Not the wood, the ice. A sheet of frozen snow broke free from the roof peak and slid fast and heavy toward the edge where Kaelra was working. The impact knocked her sideways. She lost her footing. She went over the edge. The fall was 30 feet. The snow on the ground was deep. 3 feet at the base of the barn wall, and the depth absorbed the impact that the height should have produced. She did not hit the ground at terminal velocity. She hit a snowbank at a speed that was survivable, but not gentle. Edric was out the barn door before the snow settled. He found her on her back in the drift. Her left arm, the white-marked arm, bent at an angle that arms are not designed to achieve. Broken. The same arm. The arm that carried the mark of the debt that had brought her here. He knelt beside her. She was conscious. Amber eyes open, jaw clenched. The specific expression of a person processing acute pain through the filter of orc stoicism, which meant the pain was not expressed, but endured, and the enduring was visible only in the tension of the jaw and the brightness of the eyes. The arm, she said. Unnecessary narration. Edric could see the break. But orc communication protocol required the injured party to identify the injury, because assumption was considered unreliable and verbal confirmation was structural. I need to set it, Edric said. Can you walk? I can walk with broken legs. Arm is manageable. He helped her up. She walked, orc pride requiring ambulation even when ambulation was inadvisable. They went into the cabin. Not the barn, the cabin, because the barn's roof was clear and the cabin's fire was burning, and the protocol that kept Kaelra in the barn had just been overridden by the reality of a broken arm and a storm that was not interested in orc customs. Edric examined the break. The bone, orc bone, denser than human, thicker, was fractured, but not displaced. A clean break that would heal cleanly if set properly. But orc bone required orc-specific treatment, and Edric's medical knowledge was human-specific, and the gap between the two was a problem. "Tell me what to do," he said. Kaelra told him. Through clenched teeth, in short sentences, she described the orc bone-setting technique, the angle, the pressure, the specific manipulation that orc skeletal structure required. Edric listened, adjusted, applied. His hands, the careful, attentive hands of a man who had spent 4 years fixing things that needed fixing, followed her instructions with the precision that the situation demanded, and the gentleness that the situation did not require, but that he provided anyway. The bone set. Kaelra exhaled, a long, shaking breath, the release of pain that had been held during the procedure. Edric wrapped the arm in splinting, strips of wood, cloth binding, the improvised field medicine of a man working with available materials. The white mark was visible through the wrapping. The stripe of damaged skin ran from shoulder to wrist, crossing the break site, the evidence of the river and the evidence of the roof existing on the same arm on the same person, in the same story. "You saved the barn," Edric said. "The barn is not your life. The cattle in it are my livelihood. Without them, the debt requires your life, not your livelihood. A barn is wood. Cattle are assets. Your heart beating is the currency I owe." She looked at the splinted arm. "I fell off your roof trying to save your barn and broke the arm you already damaged by saving me. There is a symmetry to this that I do not enjoy. Are we even? We are not even. A broken arm is not a saved life. The ledger is still open." "Kaelra." "Yes? Stop talking about the ledger. The ledger is an abstraction. You fell off my roof, you broke your arm, you're in my cabin, in my bed, with my splint on your bone, and outside the storm is still going, and you're talking about a scouting." Kaelra looked at him. The amber eyes held the specific recalibrating quality of a person whose framework has been challenged by a perspective it did not anticipate. "What should I talk about instead? How about the fact that you went onto a roof in a blizzard because you didn't want me to die, and that the not wanting is separate from the debt, and that you and I both know it?" The cabin was quiet. The storm continued outside. Wind, snow, the ongoing argument between weather and structure. Inside, the fire burned. The splint held. The white mark glowed in the firelight. Kaelra didn't answer. She didn't need to. The not answering was the answer. And the answer was that Edric was right, and that being right was a problem because it meant the architecture she had been maintaining. The debt, the ledger, the clean separation between obligation and choice, had a crack in it, and the crack was shaped like a question she was not ready to ask. She slept in the cabin that night. In Edric's bed, Edric slept on the floor, by the fire, wrapped in the sheepskin she was still not acknowledging as a kindness. In the morning, the storm was over. The barn was standing. The cattle were alive. The arm was broken, and the distance between the cabin and the barn had collapsed to 0, and neither of them was in a hurry to rebuild it. She went onto the roof in a blizzard because the debt said his life was hers to protect. She fell, broke the same arm that carried the white mark. He set the bone while she told him how. 2 people. 1 splint, 1 storm. "Stop talking about the ledger," he said. "The not wanting me to die is separate from the debt. And we both know it." She didn't answer. The not answering was the answer. Subscribe to human and orc girl history for what comes next. The clan is coming. Spring arrived the way spring arrives in border country, reluctantly, in increments, as though winter had filed an appeal and the seasonal court was still deliberating. The snow retreated uphill. The river thawed. The ice that had nearly killed Kaelra broke apart and floated downstream in jagged pieces that carried the memory of the cold and nothing else. Kaelra's arm healed. Orc bone knitted faster than human bone. 6 weeks instead of 8. the fracture closing with a density that exceeded the original structure. The splint came off on a morning in early March, and Kale reflects the arm, testing the range, the strength, the specific mechanical confidence that a body requires before it trusts a repaired component. The white mark was still there, shoulder to wrist, vivid against the deepening green of skin restored to full health by 2 months of adequate food, regular warmth, and the specific, undefined benefit of not being alone. The mark had not faded. It would not fade. It was as permanent as the decision that had produced it. A man reaching into frozen water and pulling. They were in the yard, Edric repairing the barn roof section that the storm had damaged, Kaelra holding the timber while he nailed, when the riders appeared on the eastern ridge. 6 of them mounted on the heavy-boned horses that orc clans used for long-distance travel. They descended the ridge in a line, riding at a walk, their approach unhurried and deliberate, the specific pace of people who wanted to be seen coming. Kaelra set down the timber. She looked at the riders. Her body changed. The relaxed working posture of the past 2 months replaced by something older, something trained, the instantaneous reconfiguration of a scout identifying incoming elements. "My clan," she said. They arrived at the farm's fence line and dismounted. 5 warriors, young, armed, carrying the specific tension of soldiers entering territory they considered hostile. And 1 elder, the elder was a woman, old, 70 or more, with the compressed, concentrated authority of a person whose age had not diminished her, but distilled her. Her hair was silver white, braided in the orc elder style, complex multiple plaits, each one carrying a bead or a token that signified rank, achievement, or authority. Her face bore the deep lines of decades of leadership, and her eyes, dark, not amber, the specific deep brown of orc elders whose pigment has shifted with age, held the comprehensive, evaluative quality of a person who had been assessing people for longer than most people had been alive. Her name was Voshka. She was the clan's lawkeeper, the guardian of tradition, the interpreter of code, the person whose word determined whether customs were honored or violated, and whose judgment, once delivered, was not subject to appeal. Voshka walked to the fence. She did not cross it. The fence was a boundary, and boundaries in orc custom were respected until the person on the other side invited passage. Edric walked to the fence. He did not open it. 2 people, separated by 4 feet of timber and a decade of border conflict, performing the ancient, formal choreography of a first meeting between a host and a visitor who outranked the host by every available measure. "You are the one who pulled her from the water," Voshka said. Her common was perfect, not fluent, not functional, but perfect. The specific, controlled English of a person who had learned the language from books and diplomats, and who deployed it with a precision that native speakers rarely achieved. "I am. Show me your hands." Edric extended his hands, palms up. Voshka examined them through the fence. The calluses, the scars, the specific physical history of a man's labor written in the skin. She read them the way Kaelra had read the fence line, with the trained, comprehensive assessment of a person who gathered information from surfaces. "Farmers' hands," Voshka said, "not soldiers." "I've never been a soldier. Then you pulled my granddaughter from the ice with farmers' hands." Interesting. The word granddaughter rearranged the room, or the yard, or the situation, or whatever the space was that contained this conversation. Kaelra was Voshka's granddaughter, the lawkeeper's granddaughter. The highest-ranking elder in the clan had a personal stake in the Threv Cal, and the personal stake was standing in the yard with a white-marked arm and an expression that Edric could not read. "Come in," Edric said. He opened the fence gate. They sat in the cabin, Edric, Kaelra, and Voshka. The warriors remained outside, positioned around the farm's perimeter with the professional, attentive stillness of soldiers performing security rather than aggression. "Caw, how can you really get an outfit to try and interview your faith? What else is I going on the dial? But his cap is always a bad wall." Between her picking, take, and boshing, Voshka looked at the cabin. She looked at the single bed, the 2 chairs, the table with 2 plates, the fire, the sheepskin folded on the floor beside the hearth. She was reading the space the way she read everything, as a text, dense with information. telling a story that the inhabitants might not realize they were narrating. "You have been here how long?" Vashka asked Kaelra. "2 months. The arm, broken, healed. The roof, I was clearing snow. You were protecting his property. I was protecting him. The barn collapses. The cattle die. He loses his livelihood. He can't survive the winter. His life depends on the barn. The barn was in danger. I addressed the danger." Vashka's dark eyes moved from Kaelra to Edric, to the white mark on Kaelra's arm, to the 2 plates on the table, to the sheepskin on the floor. The reading was comprehensive. The conclusions were being assembled. "You know what the mark means," Vashka said to Edric. "Kaelra told me. Threvkal, the life debt. She stays until she saves my life. That is what she told you. Is there more?" Vashka looked at Kaelra. Kaelra looked at the floor. The looking at the floor was not evasion. It was acknowledgement. The specific, physical admission of a person who knows that information she has been withholding is about to be delivered, and who has chosen not to deliver it herself. "Threvkal is not only a life debt," Vashka said. "In the ancient code, the law that predates the border, predates the war, predates every arrangement humans and orcs have made in the past century. Threvkal between an orc woman and a man who saves her carries a second provision." The cabin was very quiet. The fire crackled. The wind pressed against the walls. "The man who saves an orc woman from death earns the right of claim. He may, if he chooses, claim the woman as his own. Not as property, as partner. The claim is a marriage right. In the old code, the saving is the courtship, and the man's decision to exercise the claim is the proposal." Edric looked at Vashka. He looked at Kaelra. He looked at the white mark on her arm, the arm that had been white since the river, that had broken on his roof, that had healed in his cabin, that had carried firewood and sharpened knives and held timber while he nailed. "You knew this," he said to Kaelra. "Yes, from the beginning, from the moment I saw the mark. Why didn't you tell me?" Kaelra looked at him. The amber eyes held something that the 2 months of cohabitation had been building, a quality that was not debt, not obligation, not the specific architecture of Threvkale, but something that existed beneath and alongside it, growing in the same soil, using the same roots. "Because if I told you, you would have sent me away, or you would have kept me for the wrong reason. Either way, what we built, the working, the silence, the stew, the fence line, would have been contaminated by the knowing. I wanted the thing we built to be clean, built from days, not from law." The sentence was the longest continuous statement Kaelra had made in 2 months. It contained more emotional content than every previous conversation combined. It landed in the cabin with a weight that the structure, 1 room, 1 bed, 2 chairs, a fire, a sheepskin, was not designed to bear but bore anyway. Vashka watched the exchange. Her dark eyes tracked the words, the silences, the micro-expressions, the specific nonverbal communication that 2 people who have been living together produce without conscious effort. "You have the right of claim," Vashka said to Edric. "The law permits it. The mark confirms it. If you claim her, the Threvkal resolves. The debt is paid. The mark changes. She is yours." Edric looked at the orc elder. He looked at the law she was presenting, the ancient pre-border code that gave a man the right to claim a woman because he had kept her alive. The code was clear. The code was old. The code was, by every standard Edric understood, wrong. "No," he said. Vashka's expression did not change. The dark eyes held him. "I don't claim people," Edric said. "I don't own people. I pulled her from the ice because she was drowning, not because I wanted to acquire something. If your law says that saving a life creates a right to that life, then your law confuses rescue with purchase, and I'm not interested in the confusion. You reject the claim. I reject the concept of claiming a person. The law can permit whatever it wants. I'm not the law. I'm a farmer who found a woman in the water and brought her to the fire. That's what happened. That's all that happened. The rest, the claim, the right, the ownership, that's your law adding chapters to a story that was 1 page long. Vashka looked at Edric for a duration that exceeded social convention and entered the territory of assessment. She was weighing something, not his words, which she had heard, but his weight, the specific gravity of a man who had been offered something and had refused it not because he didn't want it, but because wanting it through the mechanism being offered would have corrupted the wanting itself. "You understand what you're doing," Vashka said. "By rejecting the claim, you relinquish the right permanently. You cannot change your mind. The law does not offer second chances. I don't need a second chance at something I shouldn't have had a first chance at." Vashka turned to Kaelra. "The claim is rejected. The Threfkow remains open. The debt is unpaid. You are—" "Wait," Edric said. "I'm not done." Vashka waited. "I reject the claim. I also clear the debt. I, the creditor, cancel the obligation. Kaelra owes me nothing. The Threfkow is void. Not because it was paid, because I'm choosing not to collect. You cannot. I can. If the law gives me the right to claim a person's life, it gives me the right to release that life. I'm exercising the release. Kaelra is free. No debt, no claim, no ledger." The cabin held its breath. The fire crackled, the wind pressed, and Vashka, the lawkeeper, the interpreter of codes, the woman whose word was final. Vashka was silent. "In 40 years of keeping this law," Vashka said, "no man, orc or human, has rejected the claim. In 40 years, no creditor has voluntarily canceled a Threvcall. You are the first. Then your law has been waiting 40 years for someone to do the right thing." Vashka looked at Kaelra. "You are free. The debt is canceled. The claim is rejected. You may return to the clan. When the mark fades—" "The mark won't fade," Kaelra said. Vashka stopped. "It changes," Kaelra said. "You told me yourself. When the debt is dishonored, the mark stays white. When the debt is paid, the mark turns silver. But this—" She looked at her arm, at the white stripe that ran from shoulder to wrist. "This is neither. The debt wasn't paid. It wasn't dishonored. It was canceled. By the creditor. Voluntarily. What color does the mark turn when the debt is forgiven?" Vashka looked at the mark. Her dark eyes held the specific recalculating quality of a person encountering a scenario that her expertise had not prepared her for. "I don't know," Vashka said. "This has never happened." The answer came at dawn. Kaelra woke in the barn. She had returned to the loft after the meeting, because the protocol of the previous night's events required time and space, and the specific private processing that orcs performed alone, rather than in company. She looked at her arm. The white was changing, not fading, transforming. The bleached, damaged skin was developing a luminosity that had not been there before, a sheen, a glow, the specific metallic quality of a surface catching light and returning it differently than it received it. Silver. Not the dark silver of tarnished metal, not the pale silver of winter sky. A living silver, warm, luminous, carrying the specific quality of something that had been changed from one state to another through a process that neither tradition nor law had a name for. The mark had turned silver, not because the debt was paid, not because the debt was honored, because the debt was forgiven. And forgiveness, it turned out, produced a color that the law had never seen, because the law had never needed to account for it. Kaelra walked out of the barn. The morning light was clear and cold and new, the first genuine spring morning, the air carrying the smell of meltwater and bare soil and the specific, optimistic chemistry of a world resuming operations after a season of suspension. Edric was in the yard. Coffee. Morning routine. The unchanged, unchanging rhythm of a man who did not know that the mark had changed, and would not know until she showed him. She walked to him. She extended her arm. The silver stripe caught the morning light and threw it back in a warm, luminous line that ran from her shoulder to her wrist. The entire length of the mark transformed. Edric looked at it. He looked at her. "Silver," he said. "Silver. What does it mean?" Nobody knows. Vashka doesn't know. This has never happened. A canceled debt, a forgiven Threfkale. There's no precedent. So the mark invented its own meaning. The mark responded to what happened. And what happened was new. They stood in the yard. The same yard where she had split his firewood, where she had repaired his fence, where she had walked his perimeter and sharpened his knives, and eaten his stew and broken her arm saving his barn. The yard that had been one person's yard for 4 years and had become, without a treaty or a ceremony or a legal instrument, 2 people's yard. "I can go," Kielra said. "The debt is clear. The clan will take me back." Vashka confirmed it. "I know. You canceled the debt and rejected the claim. You have no reason to ask me to stay. I know. So I need to decide. Yes, without the debt, without the law, without any reason except whatever reason you have." Kielra looked at the farm. She looked at the barn where she had slept for 2 months. She looked at the river where she had nearly died. She looked at the white, the silver, now mark on her arm that told a story no one had told before. "When the debt was active," she said, "I stayed because I had to. When the debt was canceled, I had the option to leave. But the option to leave is not the same as the desire to leave. The option opened the door. The desire decides whether I walk through it. And the door is open. I'm not walking through it." Edric looked at the orc woman standing in his yard, the scout who had walked his fence line, the hunter who had fed his table, the woman who had gone on to a roof in a blizzard because his life was worth more to her than the debt that said it should be, the person whose arm carried a mark that had turned a color no one had seen before, because no one had ever done what he had done, which was not saving her from the river but releasing her from the debt, which was the braver act, which was the act that mattered. "Good," he said. "Good. Good stay, not because of the debt, not because of the law, because the stew is better with 2 people and the fence line is more interesting when someone else walks it." Kielra's mouth did something it had been trying to do for 2 months. The tectonic motion completed its arc. The geological shift reached the surface. The expression that had been intercepted, controlled, suppressed, and managed through 60 days of orc stoicism finally arrived. She smiled. Vashka left the next morning. The warriors mounted. The formation assembled at the fence line. The elder looked at Edric through the fence rails, the same position she had occupied on arrival, the same boundary, the same formal choreography. But the content of the exchange had changed. "You saved her in winter," Vashka said. "You released her in spring. Most men would have kept the winter, the holding, the owning. You chose the spring. Spring seemed appropriate. Spring is difficult. Winter is simple. Hold, keep, possess. Spring requires letting go and seeing what grows. You let go, and she stayed." Vashka looked at Kielra, standing beside Edric at the fence, the silver mark visible on her arm in the morning light. "In 40 years, no one has produced silver. The law did not know it existed. You and my granddaughter wrote a new page in a very old book." She mounted. The formation turned. 6 riders crossed the field toward the eastern ridge, the orc horses moving at the unhurried pace of a departure that was not a loss but a transition. Kielra watched them go, her clan, riding north, leaving her at a human farm with a canceled debt, a silver mark, and a man who had refused to own her and had, in the refusing, earned something that ownership could never produce. Edric stood beside her. "Regret?" he asked. "About the river. About staying. The river was stupid. Staying is the smartest thing I've ever done." They turned from the fence. The morning was ahead. The barn needed the rest of the roof repairs. The cattle needed feeding. The fence line needed its weekly inspection. The work was the same work it had been yesterday and would be tomorrow. And the sameness was not monotony, but structure, the reliable daily architecture of a life that 2 people were building from available materials. The silver mark caught the light as Kielra lifted a timber onto her shoulder. It glowed, warm, luminous, the specific color of something that had never existed before, and that existed now, because a man had pulled a woman from the ice, and then done the harder thing, which was letting her choose whether to stay. She chose to stay. The mark agreed. He saved her in winter, he released her in spring. The mark turned silver, a color nobody had ever seen, because nobody had ever forgiven a debt that old. "The door is open," she said. "I'm not walking through it." "Good," he said. "The stew is better with 2 people. If the silver mark means something to you, subscribe to Human and Orc Girl History, and ring that bell. Every notification is a door that opens and a person who stays. And tell me in the comments, the frozen hand, the white mark, you shouldn't have done this, the stew on the hay bale, the fence line, the roof fall, stop talking about the ledger, Vashka's revelation, I don't claim people, the canceled debt, the silver, or I'm not walking through it. Which moment was yours? Drop your city.